Welcome, everyone, to Eclipsium's Below the Surface for December 2022. I'm Paul Sidorian. I'm the Principal Security Evangelist for Eclipsium. I'm joined by Mr. Scott Shefferman. Scott, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. As always, this is super fun.
Absolutely. We have a special guest on this episode. Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us. Tyler, welcome.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Scott. I'm so excited for this. This is going to be a fantastic episode.
Yeah, Scott, you went all out in your
Mm.
latest threat report. You gave us a lot of content to get through. We won't get through every single topic, so I want to make sure our audience and our listeners know to check out eclipsium.com, go to the threat report section where you can read the full threat report. Scott, you bring up a lot of great, I don't want to call them predictions, I want to call them theories. Because I think, but I actually think it's a better term for it. Some of the theories that are on there, the first one actually that I want to cover, threats both to and from the technology supply chain will increase exponentially due to exposed weaknesses in the firmware SDLC, vulnerability research advancements, and economic computing challenges.
Yeah.
What was the give us the high level behind that one, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, for the audience, like pretty much we collected a bunch of predictions from folks inside Eclipsium and trust groups as well, folks like Tyler as well, just reached out, touched a lot of sources, and came up with some of my own as well, put them in there. This one, and almost all of them boil down to either a destructive or a supply chain or a nexus of those two type of topics as it happens. So on this one, I mean, this one is almost obvious, right? Like it's on like Donkey Kong. I don't know how else to say it. Like the supply chain itself, the macro, starting at the top, the macro landscape right now is when we're in the middle of a chip war against China. We're moving production domestically. Russians being sanctioned so much that they're having to steal traffic cameras out of Sweden just to power the cameras on their drones. And that actually that's an analogy to the entire landscape for them. All of their computing resources are being starved. So there's a race to develop the best chip over that's normally a 10-year process. Intel wants to do that in 3 years and put the United States and the West on a dominant landscape. China is very aware of that. So at the macro level, this is absolutely crazy. So what that's doing is every superpower, if you will, involved in this entire situation has a different political will than they did yesterday, right? Like this is a new era we're in, and that political will is going to drive them to take advantage of offensive capabilities they can implant inside the supply chain, or like Russia often does, and criminal actors too, attack the supply chain as a place to actually get presence and persistence or disrupt and destruct the production of the IT supply chain itself. So it's the supply chain is massive and complex, like we know, but every single aspect of that supply chain comes into play under this new light, where the political will and the competition is becoming. We're not in a cooperative competition anymore. We're in a balkanized competition. That changes everything.
Yeah, and I think that anytime we see a change to something new, a new process, a new goal to, whether it's to move parts of the supply chain more close to home, the security usually takes a back seat to that. I think all of us have been around long enough to know that anytime it's like, oh, we're going to have this new version, this new process, this new manufacturing plant, that's going to open up, I think, avenues for attack because security isn't always the first priority of the. I think it's a priority, but it's not the top priority. The top priority is to start making chips here in the U.S. as an example, not to have the most secure supply chain because there's still a supply chain. Even if it doesn't matter where the chips are manufactured, we all know that firmware and all these bits of different hardware and keys and certificates are all part of the complex supply chain
Well,
that
that and the,
ultimately
the threat
delivers you your
landscape
computer
and
at the end of the day.
geopolitical side of this, like the threat landscape has changed. Like you're saying, once you bring this in-house to the United States, because they have to try harder and they have to go to different efforts and lengths to do that, which means they're now attacking IoT heavier. They have to have the inroads. They're attacking the hardware, trying to get that bootkit in there so that you're laying low and have that ongoing persistence, because our tools and processes are getting better, and if we do bring it in house, it allows more control. But that just means we're playing with a more sophisticated actor. And then you add the geopolitical side of this, like Scott was saying, like we're playing once Ukraine and Russia war kicked off and China seen their opportunity to start diving down Taiwan's play, and we got involved. We've got all of these geopolitical things that we are not as technologists often thinking about, but they play the biggest role in how we have to look at our threat landscape, look at the actors we're dealing with, and then evaluate how we're actually going to go about securing this. And like you said, on this fast track, security is going to take a backseat, and we have no way to get that up to speed quick enough to do this. And it's going to happen. So how do we actually take steps to alleviate some of that or put mitigations in place?
Well, it's a great segue, Tyler, to one of Scott's other points that I put next because Scott, you said the collection of software, firmware, and hardware bill of materials will be an insufficient mitigation for supply chain threats. I agree. And I hate to be on the panel and always be like agreeing with each other, but I've been I think I have strong criticisms to the S bombs and bills of materials, not because I think they're a bad idea entirely. I think it's all about how you use them and what value they provide. And I think people overestimate the value that it provides. I think people say, well, we have all these supply chain issues. So
Well,
let's
it's like
just have an S
compliance.
bomb
Like
or an F
compliance
bomb
has never solved
and
anything.
like magically, magic pixie dust, all our problems go away. Right?
Yeah.
That's
So
it's a piece, yeah, it's a piece of puzzle.
yeah, that's
Well, I
great.
wouldn't say
So
that, but
So the background here is I went to our VP John Lucades, who's been at Eclipsium since practically day one in 2017, and has a tremendous amount of experience working with NIST and the U.S. government and vendors on the supply chain dilemma, heavily focused on SBOM, et cetera. And obviously, John is the one that internally at Eclipsium, anyway, came up with the F bomb term, and we all laughed at dinner one night when he dropped the F bomb. But John's background is very unique, and he has a lot of insight here, and it really aligns well with my DoD insight as well, because the DoD does this all the time. You do your bill of materials, you understand your vendor provenance, you build trust around those vendors as you're developing a $30 billion satellite system or something like this, right? So in that context, we saw all the time that you can put your best foot forward, understand SBOM provenance, where the developers are located, where the software comes from, open source software included, and you still end up with things like implants and backdoors and all the problems. And John's point here is that even if we fast forward to sometime in the future in 5 years or 3 years where all the SBOM and FBOM and HBOM hardware bill of materials is perfect, like it's literally perfect, you're still left with the fact that as a decision maker in an organization, let's say as a CISO, you have to now, if you're taking that security control and saying, I'm now responsible for understanding SBOM dynamics, guess what that also does to you? It puts you in a position of responsibility now, where now you have to say, oh, if I decide not to go with, I'm going to use a random vendor, Acer laptops anymore because of a supply chain issue that I know I have in my environment because of SBOM, it doesn't mean you get to just rip out all the Acers because you're the CISO and you understand SBOM, because you have all the compatibility, you have all the dependencies, you have technology refresh, you have production uptime, you have end users, you have all of these things that all of a sudden, as a security person or a CISO leader, or even as the board,
Especially with
you're now going to have to make
the
these crazy
economy,
risk
though. The
decisions that
economy
you
too. We've got
haven't
this
even
this kind
had
of
the
zero
power to
flat
make in the
budget that
past
we're
because you
either
were
going to see
blind
for a
without
little while while
SBOM.
this
So
recession
it
plays
creates a
out.
new level
That
of
means that we're not going to have the
challenge for
capability to
organizations once
be
you try to
ripping out
take
a whole bunch of
security
hardware,
control
even though
over the
we know
hardware
those
and
risks.
firmware in your
So
environment.
we come into this
I like
this
the
interesting
predictive nature.
state
Go ahead,
where we
Tyler.
see a risk, we know a risk, but due to budgetary constraints, and maybe even there's regulatory stuff that is now forcing you to do this. Like, how do you actually do something you can't do because of the lack of money and or process? Maybe you don't even have the staff, or you've bought into something that only works on Lenovo laptops or a Dell Open Manage or HP ILO. Like all of the management and control of these, like these are long-standing, very expensive systems that an ecosystem you've probably bought into for the last 10 years. So you got all this technical debt now on top of having to manage this at a lower level that you should have been thinking about anyway, but now you have to actually figure it out because it is widely and been put on paper. So you have an obligation. Before, it's all theory, right? Like no one knows what's in the firmware. No one knows what's how secure it is. Now, when you start getting these F bombs and you start to look at all these bill of materials, you have an obligation because it has been provided to you in a data set. So you're responsible.
Yeah, I can imagine a CISO being asked by the board because they read something in the Wall Street Journal that says there's a massive supply chain coming out and it's affecting this manufacturer model, and now you're going to have the board's going to go to you as a CISO and say, what's our exposure? And so yeah, SBOM will give you that, but it's not going to alleviate everything you just talked about. It's
Yeah, but I think you need to do the investigation and the analytics before the board asks you the question. I think you already need to know what you have out there, and this is
excellent.
somewhat a page out of vulnerability management and asset management. But if you already know what you have out there, you can do some pretty basic analytics and go, what is my oldest software? What is my oldest CVE? What is my oldest hardware? What is my oldest chips inside of my hardware?
Well, so
You
that
could,
last point though,
right?
it's like it's not just make and model, right? Like that's asset
No.
management. Now we're
Yeah,
talking
what
about the
version of
component
TPM do I
level.
have in my systems? And once you know that, then you've got to do something about it. You've got to put it in a mitigating control. You've got to put in a plan. You've got to put in extra monitoring. You've got to have, take action based on those analytics. And I'm not saying you're going to solve every single problem in your organization with one fell swoop, because we all know it doesn't work that way. But if you say, hey, here's my oldest laptops, I put this additional software on them, I'm monitoring for these conditions, knowing that maybe they're more vulnerable to certain types of attacks. That's a great.
Yeah.
Then when the board comes to you, like, yeah, I know where that stuff is. And guess what? If the firmware changes, we bought this great software called Eclipsium. There's a shameless plug, right? That tells us if this firmware changes or if the
I gotta
bootloader
disagree
changed
with
on it,
Scott
because
on
we
this
know.
one.
And
I'm
by the way,
sorry. Like,
there's a 6 month or one
yeah,
year
like
plan
next
to
month.
replace that hardware.
That's it.
I also think that segues nicely into one of your next points,
Yep.
which it's highly likely within the next 2 years, a self-propagating ransomware with persistence via firmware implant will be developed and released.
All
And
right.
I think that I think we're primed for this. I think we're. You think it's going to happen sooner? Like when we're all on a holiday break is when it's going to happen, because that's
Well,
usually when
Paul,
it happens.
Paul, this is why we wanted Tyler on the show as well, because
Hmm.
Tyler has a tremendous amount of experience working with infrastructure, designing it, managing it, etc., and attacking it as well as a red teamer. He's one of the best in the world as far as I'm concerned. Not to blow smoke, but I mean, there's a reason why we wanted you on this episode specifically, along with all the other episodes you end up being on. But this one is like, so. I mean, this actually came. I went to our one of our sales engineers, Wes, and I said, Wes, what's your prediction? And he came up with this. Like, he just dropped it in like 30 seconds
Yeah.
right into the Slack chat. I'm like, are you kidding me? So, I mean, when you think about self-propagating, the question I have for Tyler is very specific here, right?
Well, my
Self-propagating,
prediction is the
normally
self
people think, okay,
propagation
it's
is
going
a
to go
thousand
across the
percent.
internet
We're
to
going to see
self-propagate.
this being leveraged
But
through
today's
IoT and wearable devices.
architectures
I think will
don't
be a huge
require just
platform in which
internet to internet
think
to
about your
propagate
ability
because
to
there's
get
so
something
many
to someone's
aspects going on in
laptop,
the
right?
cloud.
Our
There's so many
phones, our
aspects going
laptops, our
on
watches are
at
all
the
using
management layer, right? So
low
what are your
energy,
thoughts there? I mean,
NFC.
I
You're
don't
going to
even I
have
haven't even warmed you up on this, but I know you come
these
warmed up.
kits
So
that
what do you got?
implant, and then they're able to protocol shift in order to make a move, propagate themselves to targets that has some sort of intelligence AI, maybe some ML decision trees. Maybe it's just looking for very specific key indicators, but they'll leverage these self propagations for later botnet implants, but they're going to use them more for finding the target without having to use traditional 0 days initial access phishing. Those will all still be a thing, but the self-replication across hardware to get to a low-level implant is where they have to live. Like I've already been looking at a bunch of stuff with living in a GPU, living low-level in IPMI BNCs, with the network stack being available and having auto updating. Like these are things that attackers and people that make these kits and even us security researchers, like if we can write this stuff, 1,000% nation states are doing the exact same thing. Now taking that to the next step is the internet is getting a lot better at being able to detect, find infrastructure, understand the communication. So living in things that are day to day, things like your application, like TikTok on your phone, right? Okay, so it is collecting a bunch of data, probably sending it to China, doing whatever it does. What happens when there's that one update that opens an API that allows access to update your microphone? Like this is where it gets very interesting, where you start to think about, is your app sandboxed? Have you given it too much permission? And does that mean that it can implant and live on something other than the application once you install it? That's terrifying because it's so hard to dissect. Oh.
But I think
So
we base some of these decisions on assumptions. And I think this is similar to the assumption that, well, we won't see an IoT based worm run across the internet because there's too many different architectures, too many different
Okay.
types of devices. And to have one worm that would attack all of them, we're basically going to see smaller pockets. Then Mirai came along and we're like, oh, I guess they got around that limitation. And I think the big assumption that we see with UEFI based firmware PCs, servers, laptops is, well, an attacker has to be on my system. I think the exterior is
we're there.
very brittle, right? It's very brittle. It's very brittle in the amount of and the number of attack paths that lead to an attacker being on your system are vast. You can't defend that landscape, and you can't defend your network running under the assumption that an attacker is never going to be on one of my systems, because eventually it's going to happen. It's just a matter of how much time and effort someone has to go through. I don't dispute the fact that you can do defense really well, make it really hard for an attacker, but it's never 100%. And what you need to defend for is, if someone does get in that device, how do I like limit the blast radius and the amount of damage and the amount of spread that that can do? And
So
I think limiting their capacity to hide, to have such high level privileges on the device via firmware, is a really good step to take.
yeah, I mean, I'm gonna double down when you said Mirai too, because
Hmm.
and pivoting off of what Tyler brought up with IoT, there's a lot of chatter going on in certain trust groups that some of us are a part of, where there's a lot of weird stuff going on inside the home. Televisions. I won't mention a very well known audio system that fits in and it gives you surround sound and has speakers all throughout the room. Like there's a
Hmm.
firmware updates happening on their own. There's weird operations going on TVs. People's phones are acting differently than they have been recently. And obviously, we are all, always paranoid as security practitioners, but there's been something shifted in the last month about literally with the devices inside the home and how the home network is operating. Also, how routing is going on lately, like really, really weird long uh, response times on pings and routers that are flapping that never used to flap. All sorts of just weird, like BGP level stuff going on all over South America. Like, there's probably something bigger going on. It's really hard to see that because we're all in our little homes. We don't take the time to analyze the firmware on our Samsung or our LG TV. But there's definitely some weird stuff going on lately. I'll put it like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting as we talk about theories, and I sometimes I cringe when my theories come true because I've put my evil hat on, and I've theorized in the past when I was really having to researching IoT devices that, like, what happens when it becomes a jumping off point. And again, I think this is always an assumption that we make, that it's like not going to happen because we haven't seen it happen in the real world. But let's do some threat modeling and say, what if one of these devices is compromised and is used as a jumping off point to infect other things? And I think, Tyler, you're right, the phones play into that too. I often theorize that you put malware on a phone to jump inside the network, right? Your phone is connected to the network. It's then connected now to your Wi Fi and has access to all your TVs and all these things that are typically in a flat network. This even goes over to enterprises too that have this issue. So
Yeah, and
it
it's
works both ways, right? I compromise a device that can compromise a phone. And I think we're going to see these types of threats become more popular as other avenues get more difficult, right? We're going to
yeah, and
talk today in a podcast about the changing face of pen testing. Think about how much that's changed even in the past 5 years.
With
yeah.
an app on your with an app
There's
on
no
your
home.
phone
There's
that
no
manages
firewall
it
at any
too.
home.
So
Nobody's. I don't care. I mean, even the most paranoid security guy has a television, and these things are beaconing out to grab a firmware update, and your firewall's not stopping that. Like all these devices are phoning out, and the implicit trust you're providing to all of those vendors. Let's be honest, the vast majority based in China or Chinese code at least, or in Asia. What?
Yeah, and but also, like, geographic location doesn't matter.
but
I
can we
flagged a
change
story
that?
for later about, I think it was Anchor came out with a camera, and someone did the evaluation on it and was like, this thing says it doesn't talk to the cloud, but it's totally talking to the cloud. And by the way, there's a lot of other security vulnerabilities here that let anyone view the stream of your camera. So again, this issue comes down to trust. How much do we trust these devices that are inside our network that are firmware based? Because
Implicitly,
we can't trust what the manufacturer says. Maybe they're completely honest and they just introduced a bug and they haven't found it yet. I mean, that's we've seen that a million times, and that's fine too. Maybe they knew about it and shipped it anyway. I mean, there's a million different scenarios, but the point is, how do we build trust with these
I mean,
devices inside of our
we've seen
network,
the destruction
whether they're
happening.
talking to China or wherever they're talking to?
Paul, give us a destructive topic because we can't run out of time before we covered the kind of the other half of the theme. No matter
Yeah,
what, do you have one of those
you
lined
want to
up?
talk Connie Group and vigilante hacktivism?
Yeah,
Is that where you want to go?
well, that'll be a good pivot into anything destructive.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so
So yeah, okay. So destructive attacks will increase and begin to target the hypervisor and cloud infrastructure at scale. Yeah, we haven't really talked about the destructive nature. We've kind of talked about the pivoting, the gaining access, the persisting,
hmm,
but it's another
okay.
very scary thing, man. Like, what happens when someone goes, "Oh, I just want to destroy the device"?
So let me do a 30-second set stage for this. All right. So we talked about the global landscape and how the political will has shifted to target supply chain. Same statement applies to the political will to be destructive, both by criminals and nation states, but also that third class of actor, the same threat report it looks at, which is this vigilante hacktivism that's
Mhm.
often state funded or state backed as well. And the problem with those groups, unlike hacktivists of the past, like these groups are loud and proud. They're claiming victory. They're saying,
Mhm.
"Look, we just took out this," or "Look, we're about to take out this. Watch what happens." So there's a competitive, ego-driven, community-driven, a government-encouraged, government-funded apparatus that's never existed like anything like this before in the past. That is summarily out there to do one thing, which is to disrupt or destroy and claim victory. And what this does is advance all the timelines because you might have persistence at a power plant as Russia that you've had for 4 years in the United States. You've never turned that trigger to destructive because you haven't had the political will to do that because you are afraid of the retribution, the retaliation, or you're playing that as a card politically, right? But these actors, these hacktivists, and these criminal groups working with the whole, in fact, the whole underground itself, are out there beating their chest every day. So if they turn that same switch with that same persistence, right, that changes everything because you get collateral damage, you get the problem of attribution. Most of these APT actors now are acting like criminal actors, dropping ransomware payloads, and they're not just there to make money. They're not making money. They're there to wipe. They're there to disrupt. They're there to gain persistence or divert from other activities they're actually doing. And so all of this confluence of all this stuff together means that the destructive motive, I've said this a lot of times, every espionage campaign and persistence campaign literally is one line of code away 90% of the time from going from espionage long-term motive, the
Well,
value of that, to I can bring down the
well,
environment via
Matt,
the Active
you have
Directory
these
and the
nation
exact
states that,
same
like you
tooling
said,
and presence
are
they already have
acting
inside
with
the
inside of these
network.
criminal orgs. You
And the
can have
difference is
handlers
when
that are
is that
managing entire
timeline?
organizations, and
And that timeline is
they
being
don't.
pushed up. The
You have
political
no
will is pushed
attribution.
up,
You don't even
and
know
the
who's
actual
inside the
conflict, the
organization
cyber conflict
is part of
itself, is full
a
scale.
nation state. So the ability to do
Yeah, a
attribution,
lot of times they just
misattribution,
want to wipe
and
out
the
their presence.
political ramification of that, when you
Yeah,
start to
just
think about a
get
It's
large
rid
there.
of
I
scale
them.
mean, it's
war,
there
you
on
bring in
purpose so
something
they
like
can wipe out
Taiwan
any
and
trace
China,
of evidence.
or
Well, as much as
the
they can,
supply
right?
chain and the ability to leverage will, distract, and or push an agenda where they already have these groups under control and they're feeding them intel, they're giving them toolkits and pretending to be, from different nations. So they're already setting up the chess and pawn pieces. They've been doing this for a little while. Like, we have not been naive or blind to this. I don't think everybody has, but I don't think everybody realizes how many pieces are off the board right now. Like, it is a precipice for the right time to use this. You think about if China wants to go take Taiwan and their initiative is there, what is stopping them from having full on ransomware, shutting down infrastructure, taking down the financial system, and letting Russia and Ukraine, duke it out because they started something over there with destructive ransomware and we have to go step in as NATO now? Like, now they have full carte blanche to go take over Taiwan because we are all busy in 500 other areas that they have been setting up for years. Like, we cannot be blind. that is the place where they can now control, maintain that long-term access, and they can set up for things that they don't have to worry
Yeah,
about the OS, the EDR, the next firewall that is getting put on. They can live so low for such a long time because that firmware never gets updated. Even if
but
it does get
now
updated, they can live in the update and still do
put
that
that,
well.
Tyler, with
And they
your
have
perspective really
access to
quick
everything at the
on
hypervisor.
baseboard
When you look
management
at the
controllers.
cloud, you
Just
bring in
pick one
Azure
firmware thing.
AD cloud from the baseband, you are below even the hypervisor. The hypervisor is, I would say, lower than the OS, which is what's running our Active Directory, running our password managers, our SaaS application. You think about how many things are controlled via API and the ability to manage, pick a vector, financial. You want to take down the financial system? Take down some clouds. You start to take down clouds. What manages all of those millions of cloud servers and hardware? It's all at the baseband. And you can only do that large scale at the baseband. Nope. There's not people on site for these. Like these are underground, these are highly secure, and they wheel them in on forklifts just to get the racks and the compute power put into a place. You're
Yeah,
not going to replace those overnight. You're not going to replace those in
and
an
you can
SLA
destroy the baseband
within the
too. You
next
can
week,
brick the device
especially
effectively
if
because the
it's done
baseband is
during
often
a
used to
supply
restore a
chain
system
timing
that
issue
was
that
taken
it
down.
is already
But if
hard
you
to get
destroy
stuff.
the
Like this all
BMC
circles back
itself,
around.
you don't really have any recourse. That device is indefinitely down. That's a different proposition.
The vendor's not
Yeah,
going to give it
but
to
even
you.
it, right. And also, how do you get the
Time
software,
to
the
time to fly
firmware to
with
put
SPI
back on the
chips.
chip? I mean, oftentimes when you get an update, like it's just the update, and you're getting modules, inside of those capsules that are updating your firmware. You're not getting the entire piece of firmware, software, and data configuration to rebuild the flash chip that stores the firmware that runs your BMC, right? You're just getting updates. So if you wipe that out, now you're in this weird thing. Like it depends. It
Well,
depends. How,
I
how do
mean,
I rebuild it? If I can't, or the manufacturer is going to be more forthcoming in providing people this, but in order to apply it, sometimes you have to go down on the hardware level to apply it.
and get this, like, okay, that's baseboard management controllers, but think about the research like our Nate Warfield at Eclipsium has been doing on edge devices, load balancers, VPNs. Those are the most critical devices, much like the cloud example. The same thing applies to your gateway that's in a remote workforce world where you can, yeah, you can persist there, and there's a lot of advantages to wanting to persist there indefinitely because you can continuously drop payloads, continuously drop wipers, even if you're trying to be destructive. But guess what else you can do? You can brick those devices indefinitely well if you want to. And if you do that across 5,000
Well,
F5 devices at
add
once
add them
because you've
shorting
managed to
money or
hit
putting the political
an
aspect
ODay
like the
or a CDE
sanctions
that
where
just
they're
got
they're
dropped
looking to
and
short the money,
these
move
things
the
are getting hit
money
left and right for
to
access.
set the
What
markets on
if you
fire where
decide,
they've already
okay,
prepped and
any
set up because
financial
they know it's
target that's
coming, and
got
then you
an
start dropping
F5, a
stuff like that.
Citrix
Again,
ADC, a
this
Fortinet
has
device, a
multifaceted,
Pulse Secure device,
multi-implication, not
we're
just
going to
from
just
putting
drop
destruction,
those
but what does the
devices
destruction play out?
hard.
How does that
You're
affect the
screwed as an
next
operation.
supply chain
You're
or the next third party
screwed.
that's relying on this service?
The thing
Now you've
where
got a
it
cascading
always
effect,
tells you
not
when
to
you're updating.
mention the media and the misinformation, disinformation, and fear that's going to go out across that. So you can have entire countries starting to short our stocks, play with our money that's already within the recession. They can collapse an economy just by collapsing some firewalls at the right time with the right motives behind it, setting that up.
That's right.
What's interesting is when you update firmware on a device, it always tells you, hey, don't power it off while it's updating firmware. But the BMCs control power. So think about that combination of, well, maybe I'll just kick off an update process, then I'll go into the BMC and I'll just power
Hmm.
everything down while it's updating firmware. That could be a bad day for someone. That's the kind of control When we talk about it's below hypervisor level, it's below operating system level. That's the kind of control that it exerts.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this conversation goes so many directions, like Tyler's indicating too, because it does tie right back to that supply chain. I mean, malicious. Like when I was in the DoD, we worried about logic bombs. You guys remember logic bombs? Like nobody talks about those anymore. But guess what? It's a different world. We're not cooperating with China on the chip level, on the manufacturing level anymore. We're absolutely not. It's actually on. Like this challenge is on. So logic bombs come right back into play. And if you drop a bunch of devices all at the same time, kind of to Tyler's point, because you inserted a logic bomb or somebody pushes a firmware update on purpose, you've got a big problem all of the sudden that does create a lot of noise and chatter and can be timed effectively.
Yeah, you know what's interesting is one of the thoughts I had this year that I thought was interesting, and I haven't come up with great examples, and I've actually talked to a few more people about it. Is and it came from the Star Wars example when we realized that the flaw in the thermal exhaust port was a vulnerability that was put there on purpose, and it's not that it was a
Root,
backdoor or a
ping,
logic bomb necessarily.
pseudo.
It was legit a vulnerability that was put there on purpose. And I like that with my evil hat on. I like that because backdoors tend to get discovered. Right? Is a great line from war games, right? Backdoors are not secrets, right? But vulnerabilities can persist for a really long time. Look at some of the open source vulnerabilities in critical code in pseudo that persisted for like 20 years. So if I'm an attacker, I'm like, well, maybe I'll introduce a vulnerability because no one will notice it. The problem with my theory is once you exploit it, eyeballs start to go on it and it tends to get noticed. So you've got a short time window, but you can have those things there strategically, which I think is pretty scary.
And you have the plausible deniability as an actor inside a vendor
Vulnerabilities happen all the
SDLC,
time, right?
right?
Yeah.
I mean, so the SDLC itself, like this is not just about devices and firmware and the hardware supply chain. Is also at the most important technology, Microsoft. Like I don't want to mention all these vendors, but Microsoft's an obvious one. But like even security vendors, like we really need to worry about our SDLCs on the software and on the device level because that's what's being attacked, whether it's a malicious insider or whether it's somebody who actually
I think
controls the
it's going to
SDLC
continue
and has access
to
to the
get
source
bad though,
code.
because
All the
we're at
like
that point where
the
we do not
Python
have the
libraries that are being
resources or
exploited that
technical
are in
prowess.
everything,
There's not enough people that are
SSL, like it
smart
goes
enough
on
to
and on. These
evaluate
vulnerabilities, are
these
they
millions and
there on
millions of
purpose or
lines of
not?
code
At
that
the
are
end of the
getting
day, to an
created
enterprise,
in
it
just a
really
single
almost doesn't
library. You
matter.
start to talk about APIs, and
Right?
then you
That's the
look at
thing. That's
the
what's so
SaaS
messed up about
integrations
it. It's like
between
a
those APIs. And you
vulnerability
have to start with
that
the
gives you
routing and the software
RCE.
running the
It
routing
doesn't
and the
matter
hardware
why
of
it's
those.
there.
Like
It's a
the amount
problem,
of
and it will
code
be
and our
discovered and
ability
exploited in
to
the wild.
secure the
Yeah,
code,
and I
or have a
go ahead,
secure
Tyler.
SDLC, we can't do that as humans anymore. I think we've well past that point. So now we have to start looking at the technology. This is where I believe AI and ML has really good capabilities to evaluate at scale a lot of lines of code. But then you talk about the tainting of something like an AI or ML model, and you have the ability to maliciously implant that or flag it or falsely flag the code as it's doing the evaluation manually or ignoring certain pieces of the code. Again, we're back to that whole thing. So we have a point at which can we do anything about it other than maintain and get the mitigations right, starting from the very bottom. And I think that's the important part. Like that's where I love Eclipse. I don't even work for them, and they're probably my favorite company to rep because they're starting at the point we all should be thinking about, which is the lowest possible point that then protects each layer above it. And you have to do all the layers. It's defense in depth. Like we've lost our defense in depth, our ZTNA zero trust, like whatever the latest thing that is doing good security. That is where we need to get back to, but we have to start at the right point. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. Like if you start at the wrong point, it doesn't work.
And I think starting at that right point is knowing what you have, right? which is some of what our product does, but also one of those fundamental things you'll find in a lot of standards, recommendations, compliance is you have to know what you have. And when we talk about supply chain risk, knowing what you have as deep into the supply chain as you can is is a good first step, right? I mean, we kind of picked on S bombs a little bit, but that's a huge portion of that picture of I have to know what I have, right? So your S bomb is your first step.
So,
But then you got to
so
do stuff with it, right? There's a lot of things that come after that to prevent a lot of the attacks and destructive things and persistence that we talked about. I think one of the big things for me that I plucked out was having a secure update process and implementing it well on both the supplier and the consumer side, right? Being able to know when there's an update, making sure that update has integrity, and applying those updates is a huge second step to knowing what you have.
So Paul, my favorite prediction of all this is aligned with what you just said, which is from Vlad, one of our most amazing researchers,
Love Vlad.
a beautiful mind beyond
Yep.
words. And you ask somebody like that for a prediction, and it's amazing how you can condense all of that brilliance to just a simple statement, which is like, it's going to get worse, and it probably already has. And it ties to a corollary that my father, as a Marine, taught me, which is their version of Murphy's Law, is a corollary that says, anything that can go wrong, probably will.
Hmm.
But it already has. You just don't know it yet, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the point there for Vlad is like, once we actually get products like Eclipsium and visibility into S-bomb and F-bomb and H-bomb out there, and we start to see what's actually inside all of these enterprises and critical infrastructure and finance and inside technology companies, once we actually open our eyes to the breadth and the depth and the impact potential related to those threats that we haven't even discovered yet, because these threats that, like UEFI threats or BMC threats, you don't find them often because, like Tyler's saying, we're not tooled or resourced to do that yet. But once we go there, because of requirements or this global conflict we're in, we will see so much. It's going to be just completely bonkers what that does to enterprise risk management and supply chain risk management and third-party risk management. Like your MSSP, like once you ask your MSSP to attest to their firmware and hardware and device level security, imagine the burden on that MSSP to and this is a dynamic. This is not a snapshot in time. It's just like everything else in cybersecurity.
As the enterprise,
you can't say, "Well, I bought these and they're configured to secured core." Secured core is not. It's a whole suite of technologies.
We have to
even all
take that very
shipped with no vulnerabilities. Like what happens is the vendor ships a misconfigured secure core PC. So it's just as vulnerable as if it weren't secured core.
These computers need to be thought of as an asset.
It's like,
and I think
it's all secured core. There's no backdoors. There's no vulnerabilities.
Start to look at this,
but it's misconfigured.
How deep the rabbit hole starts to go. We have to take the hardware more seriously. You think about your firmware on even a personal desktop. It's something that, like, yeah, I know I need to update it. Next time I'll update it. If I'm having an issue, I'll go update the firmware. It's not like that's not my first security point that is forefront of my mind. And I think we have to start changing that. And even the vendors realizing they can't just ship crap firmware or crap configurations. The hardware almost seems secondary. The firmware, if it works, it almost seems like a secondary concern from a security and feature side. It's there, it does what it needs to do, and hey, there's some nice features, but we'll just turn them all on in case they want them so that they work. That is got to change that mindset around hardware being that first vector of input. We've put a lot of effort on the firewall for a little while. We've done email filtering now. Now we're at the EDR, endpoint, XDR, whatever it is right now. All of those things, we've been putting those focus points as the threat landscapes change. It's time to shift that to the hardware side of what the threat landscape is.
Yeah,
Scott, closing thoughts, Scott.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm just going to put off what Tyler said, because when we say the word hardware or firmware, all we mean is software. And there is a tremendous, actually the majority of operating systems in a 50,000 device network is firmware operating systems. The majority, for every one Windows OS you have 4 or 5 or 10 sub operating systems running software that's dynamic, talking to each other, that phones up for firmware updates, that allows bidirectional communication to and from the operating system, whether it's the UEFI or the BMC, that ships with drivers that are used for privilege escalation or run system level commands as a user. All of this package of software, whether it's at the hardware firmware application layer, all of that is one giant supply chain challenge that we have. And we're not looking at that, to Tyler's point, holistically enough to understand the entire iceberg underneath the water. We're so focused on this little tip up here: EDR, XDR, AV, spearphishing. That's not the game right now. That is not the problem we have. And the three of us are looking forward. Eclipse Team's looking forward. A lot of people are looking forward. Even the U.S. government is looking way ahead compared to the rest of the cyber industry. As cyber practitioners, we suck at this aspect of cybersecurity. As an entire industry, I'm at 25 years in the industry before I even had an inkling of a clue of how powerful, impactful, and relatively easy it is now to target the device level firmware. Like, I had no idea after 25 years and doing all the requirements across DISA, NSA, DoD, compliance, all of it. All of that has been latent, but now the U.S. government is coming through and saying, no, if you're going to settle the federal government, you have to show and attest that you're developing secure firmware and devices before the government can procure it. And that's just that's just the coming out of the executive order. I mean, it's going to get way more nuanced than that. And I think it's ironic that we as hackers, as a community, are so reluctant to spend time looking at this space. We're so myopic in how we present the security problem as our own vendor telemetry and solution.
Thanks, guys. Love you too.
Molds us into as practitioners. It's not the game. The game is much bigger than we are as a cybersecurity industry. It needs government. It needs industry. It needs all the things to even get remotely solved.
Scott, Tyler, thank you so much for appearing on this edition of Below the Surface.
Thanks for having us. Tyler, you're awesome, man. Thanks for
Happy holidays, everyone. We'll see you next year. Take care.
All right. See you guys.